July 4, 1855, Magnolia Grove Plantation, Louisiana. The smell of magnolias couldn't mask the scent of fear that would soon fill the air. Hannah, that was the name of the woman who, on America's Independence Day, served her masters their final meal in cast iron that glowed like hellfire itself. She was 28 years old with hands that knew every secret of the kitchen, every temperature that could heal or harm. They had trained her to cook for them, to nourish them, to keep them alive. But on that sweltering July morning, Hannah's hands would serve a different purpose entirely. The plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of Louisiana Delta, where the Mississippi River carved its muddy path toward the Gulf. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the air, thick with humidity, made every breath feel borrowed. This was Magnolia Grove, owned by the Beauregard family for 3 generations, where cotton fields stretched beyond sight and human souls were counted alongside livestock in leather-bound ledgers. Hannah moved through the kitchen as dawn broke over the plantation. Her movements were precise, economical, the result of 18 years spent in service to the Beauregard family and their guests. She was tall for a woman of her time, nearly 6 feet, with shoulders broad from hauling cast iron pots and arms corded with muscle from kneading bread for 50 mouths every morning. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, and her eyes held depths that the Beauregards had never bothered to fathom. They saw her hands, her back, her ability to transform raw ingredients into feasts that impressed their neighbors. They never saw the memory that lived behind those eyes, sharp as any blade she wielded. The kitchen house stood separate from the main plantation home, connected by a covered walkway that Hannah had walked 10,000 times. Inside, copper pots hung from iron hooks, their surfaces reflecting the orange glow of the cooking fire that never died. The massive hearth dominated one wall, large enough for a grown man to stand inside, with iron arms that could swing heavy cauldrons over flames hot enough to melt silver. This morning, like every morning for the past decade, Hannah began her preparations before the sun cleared the tree line. But this morning was different. This morning, 7 names echoed in her mind like a funeral dirge. Beauregard, Morrison, Whitfield, Hayes, Campbell, Stevens, Turner. 7 men who had gathered at Magnolia Grove to celebrate Independence Day with whiskey, cards, and the casual cruelty that had shaped Hannah's entire existence. Before we continue with this story of resistance written in fire and oil, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hannah's story began not in Louisiana, but in Virginia, where she was born to a woman named Grace who died before Hannah could walk. The plantation records listed her birth as property acquired, not life begun. She was sold at age 10 to the Beauregards, torn from the only family she had known. Her grandmother, Mama June, who had taught her that every recipe carried the memory of those who came before. Mama June had whispered stories while they worked side by side in the Virginia kitchen. Stories of ancestors who had fought back, who had found ways to resist that their masters never suspected. The kitchen, Mama June had said, her weathered hands guiding Hannah's small ones around a wooden spoon, is where we hold our power. Fire don't care who feeds it. Iron don't ask permission to burn. Those words lived in Hannah's chest like coals, glowing brighter each year she spent at Magnolia Grove. The Beauregards prided themselves on their hospitality. Their ability to host elaborate gatherings that showcased their wealth and refinement. They never questioned how Hannah could prepare feasts for 30 guests with such precision, never wondered about the intelligence required to coordinate multiple courses, manage timing, and transform simple ingredients into culinary artistry. They saw her as an extension of their kitchen tools, valuable, well-maintained, but ultimately just another possession. Master Charles Beauregard boasted to his friends about his cook's abilities, the way other men bragged about their fastest horses or finest hunting dogs. Hannah's worth 3 ordinary cooks, he would say, tobacco juice staining his grey beard. Got her trained up proper since she was knee-high. But Hannah remembered everything they thought she would forget. Every casual slap when the soup was too hot or too cold. Every night the young masters came to the kitchen house with whiskey on their breath and violence in their intentions. Every morning she found bruises on the younger girls who worked alongside her, marks that matched the rings worn by their owners. She remembered Sarah, sweet Sarah with the singing voice, Only 16 when Master Morrison decided she belonged in his bed instead of the laundry house. Hannah found Sarah's body floating face down in the creek 3 months later, after Morrison grew tired of her resistance and decided broken dolls weren't worth keeping. She remembered Thomas, gentle Thomas, who carved animals from wood scraps and told stories to make the children laugh. Master Whitfield beat him to death with a shovel handle for teaching his own son to read, said educated slaves were dangerous slaves. She remembered little Mary, bright Mary with curious eyes who asked too many questions. Master Hayes sold her to a cotton plantation in Mississippi when she was 12, payment for a gambling debt. Hannah never saw her again, but she knew what happened to small girls on cotton plantations, bonds where men worked children until their hearts stopped beating. 7 masters. 7 names burned into Hannah's memory like brands. 7 men who had stolen, brutalized, and murdered the people Hannah loved, then gathered at their tables expecting her to serve them with gratitude and submission. For 18 years, Hannah had served them. For 18 years, she had watched and remembered and planned. She knew their routines, their preferences, their weaknesses. Charles Beauregard liked his coffee scalding hot and his eggs barely set. Morrison preferred his meat bloody and his vegetables soft. Whitfield had a sweet tooth and would eat himself sick on pralines if given the chance. Hayes demanded everything seasoned to perfection, claiming he could taste the difference between salt from different oceans. Hannah knew all of this because she had to know, because her life depended on anticipating their desires before they voiced them, on reading their moods in the set of their shoulders and the tone of their voices. She had studied them with the intensity of a general studying enemy positions, mapping their habits and preferences like battle plans. The Independence Day gathering had been planned for months. 7 of the wealthiest plantation owners in Louisiana coming together to celebrate American freedom while owning over 3,000 human beings between them. The irony wasn't lost on Hannah. As she prepared for their feast, she thought about Mama June's words. "Freedom ain't something they give you, child. It's something you take." The night before, Hannah had made her final preparations. Not for the meal they expected, but for the reckoning they had earned. She moved through the kitchen in darkness, her feet finding familiar paths without thought. Every pot had been scrubbed until it gleamed. Every surface cleaned and organized with military precision. The reed cauldrons had been filled with oil and positioned over the massive hearth, ready for the morning's work. But this morning's work wouldn't be the feast they anticipated. This morning, Hannah would serve justice instead of breakfast, and the menu would include only one course: accountability served boiling hot. July 4th, 1855, dawned clear and humid, the kind of Louisiana morning where the air itself seemed to sweat. Hannah was in the kitchen before sunrise, as she had been every morning for 18 years. But today, her movements carried a different weight. Today, her hands shook not from fear, but from anticipation. The 7 masters would arrive by mid-morning, expecting a feast worthy of their status. They would gather in the main dining room, drinking whiskey and discussing cotton prices while Hannah and the other house servants moved invisibly around them, filling glasses and clearing plates. It was a routine they had performed dozens of times, a choreography of power and submission that Hannah knew by heart. But today, the choreography would be different. Today, Hannah would direct the dance. She began by heating the oil. 7 massive cauldrons, each large enough to hold a grown man, positioned over flames that turned the kitchen air wavy with heat. The oil, gallons of it, saved and collected over months of careful planning, began its slow transformation from liquid to weapon. At room temperature, it was harmless, useful for frying chicken and making biscuits. But heated to boiling, it became something else entirely, justice distilled to its most elemental form. Hannah didn't cry, she just worked. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, tending the fires, monitoring the temperature, preparing the tools she would need. Cast iron ladles with handles long enough to keep her at safe distance. Thick leather gloves to protect her hands from splatter. Wooden blocks positioned to help her maneuver the heavy cauldrons. The oil wasn't for frying, it was for freedom. As the morning progressed, the other kitchen workers arrived to begin their preparations. Hannah sent them away one by one, with tasks that would keep them clear of the kitchen house. "Take the bread to the main house," she told young Samuel. Polish the silver, she instructed Rebecca. Gather eggs from the far coops, she directed James. By 10 o'clock, Hannah was alone in the kitchen, with 7 cauldrons of oil heated to temperatures that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. The air shimmered with heat waves, and the smell of hot oil filled every corner of the room. Outside, she could hear horses arriving, voices calling greetings, the familiar sounds of masters gathering to celebrate their dominion over others. But inside the kitchen house, revolution was preparing to serve itself. The first to enter was Charles Beauregard himself, drawn by what he assumed was the smell of breakfast being prepared. He stepped through the doorway, expecting to find Hannah bent over her usual preparations, ready to receive his morning criticisms and demands. Instead, he found Hannah standing beside a cauldron of boiling oil with a cast iron ladle in her hands and 18 years of accumulated rage in her eyes. "Hannah," he said, his voice carrying the automatic authority of a man who had never questioned his right to command others. "What's that smell?" "That ain't breakfast I'm smelling." Hannah looked at him across the steaming kitchen. This man who had owned her body but never understood her mind. This man who had sold children like livestock and raped women like it was his divine right. This man who had stolen 18 years of her life and countless lives of those she loved. "No, Master Charles," Hannah said, her voice steady as stone. "It ain't breakfast." She moved faster than he could react, faster than his whiskey-soaked reflexes could process. The ladle swung in a perfect arc, delivering a gallon of oil heated to 400 red degrees directly onto his face and chest. The scream that emerged from Charles Beauregard's throat wasn't human. It was the sound of justice being served at exactly the right temperature. He fell backward, clawing at his face, and Hannah was already moving toward the second cauldron. Morrison came running at the sound of screaming, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt. But Hannah had planned for this too. The kitchen floor was slick with oil she had spilled strategically, and Morrison's boots found no purchase. He went down hard, and Hannah was standing over him before he could rise, another ladle full of liquid fire ready to pour. "This is for Sarah," Hannah said, and Morrison's screams joined the symphony. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock and fear. Behind him, Hannah could see the other masters gathering. Their morning celebration turned into something they had never imagined possible. Accountability delivered by the hands they had assumed would always serve them. "You remember Thomas?" Hannah asked Whitfield, who was backing away from her steady advance. "Remember how you beat him to death for teaching letters? Remember how you laughed when he begged for his children's sake?" The oil found its mark with surgical precision. Whitfield's screams added to the chorus, and Hannah felt something break loose in her chest. Not her heart, but the chains that had bound it for 18 years. Hayes tried to run. Campbell drew his gun. Stevens called for help from slaves who suddenly seemed to have disappeared entirely. Turner backed against the wall, his face gray with terror as he realized that the woman he had casually brutalized for years had spent those years planning this exact moment. Hannah moved through them like an avenging angel armed with cast iron and justified rage. Each ladle full of oil carried the weight of specific memories, specific losses, specific promises she had made to the dead. This one for Sarah, who sang while she worked. This one for Thomas, who carved hope from wood scraps. This one for Lee Mary, sold like cattle to pay for gambling debts. The kitchen house filled with screams and the smell of burning flesh, but Hannah's hands never shook. She had practiced this choreography in her mind 10,000 times, and now she performed it with the precision of a master craftsman, completing her greatest work. Hayes fell beside the massive hearth, his expensive clothes smoldering. Campbell's gun clattered across the oil-slick floor as he writhed in agony. Stevens pressed himself against the wall, but there was nowhere to run from 18 years of accumulated justice. Turner tried to crawl toward the door, but Hannah's shadow fell across him like an eclipse. "Please," Turner gasped, his voice barely recognizable through his pain. "Please, Hannah, I got children." Hannah paused, the ladle heavy in her hands. "Sarah had children too," she said quietly. "Thomas had children. Mary was somebody's child." The oil found its target with the same precision as all the others. When the screaming finally stopped, Hannah set down the empty ladle and surveyed her work. 7 masters lay scattered across the kitchen floor like broken dolls, their bodies steaming in the humid air. The smell of burned flesh mixed with the lingering scent of magnolias from the garden outside, creating a perfume of justice finally served. Hannah walked to the kitchen window and looked out across the plantation grounds. In the distance, she could see field workers stopping their labor to listen to the silence that had replaced the screaming. House servants emerged from where they had hidden, their faces showing a mixture of terror and something else, something that might have been hope. She thought about Mama June, who had died still enslaved, but had lived long enough to plant seeds of resistance in a 10-year-old girl's heart. She thought about Sarah and Thomas and little Mary, and all the others whose names were written in the plantation's ledgers as property, but lived in Hannah's memory as family. The kitchen fire still burned in the great hearth, its flames unchanged by the morning's work. Hannah added more wood, banking the coals to keep the fire alive. Someone else would need to tend it tomorrow, but that was tomorrow's concern. Today, she had kept her promise to the dead. By afternoon, the news had spread beyond Magnolia Grove. Hannah made no attempt to hide or run. She sat on the kitchen steps, still wearing her blood-stained apron, waiting for whatever would come next. When the authorities arrived, the sheriff, the militia, the inevitable crowd of white men with ropes and rage, they found her exactly where she intended to be found. They asked her why she had done it, as if 18 years of brutality needed explanation. They wanted to know how she had planned it, as if the details mattered more than the decades of accumulated injustice that had made planning necessary. They demanded to know if others had helped her, as if one woman's resistance required conspiracy rather than simply courage. Hannah answered their questions with the same steady voice she had used to serve their meals for 18 years. Yes, she had killed them. Yes, she had planned it. No, nobody had helped her. This was her work, her choice, her responsibility. She offered no apologies and asked for no mercy. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than a day. The verdict was never in doubt. A slave who killed her masters could expect only one outcome. But Hannah had never expected to survive her revolution. Freedom, she had learned from Mama June's stories, sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice. On July 15, 1855, 11 days after Independence Day, Hannah was hanged in the town square of New Orleans. The crowd that gathered to watch was larger than any that had come to see a slave execution before. Some came for the spectacle, but others came to witness something else, the end of a woman who had refused to accept that her life belonged to anyone but herself. Hannah walked to the gallows with the same steady pace she had used to cross the kitchen floor with ladles full of boiling oil. She wore a simple grey dress, clean and pressed, her hair braided and pinned with the same precision she had brought to every task she had performed in life. When they asked if she had any final words, she looked out over the crowd and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I ain't sorry for what I done," she said. "Only sorry it took me 18 years to do it." The hangman's rope ended Hannah's life, but it couldn't end her story. Word of what she had done spread through the slave quarters of Louisiana like fire through dry cotton. Kitchen workers whispered her name while they prepared meals for their masters. Field hands carried her story from plantation to plantation during harvest season. House servants passed down the tale of the woman who had turned cooking oil into weapons of liberation. The Beauregard plantation never recovered from that Independence Day. The surviving family members sold the property within a year, unable to find workers willing to replace those who had witnessed Hannah's revolution. The kitchen house was torn down, but former slaves in the area claimed they could still smell burning oil on humid summer mornings. Hannah's story became legend, then myth, then something more powerful than either: inspiration. In the years leading up to the Civil War, her name was whispered in slave quarters across the South as proof that resistance was possible, that masters could be held accountable, that justice could be served even by hands that had been trained only to serve others. The kitchen tools she had used, the ladles, the cauldrons, the long-handled spoons, became symbols of a different kind of cooking, a different, errant kind of nourishment. Kitchen workers who heard her story looked at their own tools with new eyes, understanding that the same hands that prepared meals could also prepare revolution. Modern historians have debated the details of Hannah's story, questioning whether one woman could have planned and executed such a precise attack without help. whether the death toll was accurate, whether the cooking oil could have been heated to lethal temperatures using only wood fires. But those questions miss the point entirely. Hannah's truth isn't found in the specific mechanics of her revenge, but in the 18 years of accumulated injustice that made revenge inevitable. Her story isn't about cooking oil or kitchen tools. It's about the moment when a human being decides that existence without dignity isn't existence at all, that some prices are worth paying for the right to die as yourself rather than live as someone else's property. In Louisiana today, tourists visit restored plantation homes and marvel at the grandeur of antebellum architecture. They walk through preserved kitchens and admire the massive hearths, the copper pots, the cast iron tools that made elaborate entertaining possible. Most never learn about Hannah, whose story isn't included in the official tours or commemorative plaques. But her legacy lives in every act of resistance, every refusal to accept injustice, every moment when someone decides that their humanity is worth more than their safety. Hannah cooked her masters in boiling oil on Independence Day because she understood, in a way they never could, what independence actually meant. The fire she lit in that kitchen house on July 4th, 1855, burns still. Not in the hearth that was torn down over a century ago, but in the memory of those who understand that freedom isn't something granted by others. It's something claimed by those brave enough to pay its price. If this story moves you to tears or rage or recognition, it's because Hannah's courage echoes across time to remind us that resistance is always possible, that dignity can never be permanently stolen, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin in the humblest places with the simplest tools. Subscribe and share this story with those who understand that history's greatest heroes often died unknown, their names recorded not in marble monuments, but in the hearts of those who refuse to let courage be forgotten.